But I've got to say something about this claim that you should be blamed for thinking something, believing something X because X is false. Nobody believes that. That's so bad.
Welcome to a theological dust-up hosted by FreeThinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and with me once again is my new ally and partner in crime against deterministic dictators and anyone else who opposes the free-thinking argument. Please welcome freedom fighter extraordinaire, the one, the only, Dr. J.P. Moreland. There he is.
Hey, my brother, it's so good to be with you again, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, I am too. We have a lot to talk about. So let's cut to the chase and get down to business.
Let's do it.
All right. In part one, we began to provide a general overview of some of the big ideas behind the free thinking argument. And we also answered several questions from people who contacted us through Facebook and Twitter. And so we're going to continue to respond to questions and objections raised against the free thinking argument in this video. So let's start with a question sent to me, BJ Allen. And BJ asks if we could discuss Frankfurt case scenarios and asks, do these cases make the case for determinism or compatibilism or for libertarian freedom? What do you think, JP?
Well, Harry Frankfurt developed a famous counter argument trying to show that you could be morally responsible even if you didn't have the power to do otherwise. And it's called the Frankfurt counterexamples. And it goes something like this. Suppose that a mad scientist has inserted an electrode in your brain so that he can observe all your mental states and thoughts and so on. And he wants a particular individual to be shot, and you have a gun in your hand. And if he sees that through your own deliberations, you're going to shoot this person, the scientist just lays off and doesn't do anything. However, if he sees that you're not going to shoot the individual, then he intervenes and creates the mental states that will determine that you do so. And so, fortunately, you decide to do it yourself and you shoot this gentleman. You're responsible, but you couldn't have done otherwise because he would have intervened had you not chosen to and made sure that that took place. Now, this is supposed to show that you could have moral responsibility without the ability to do otherwise. Does it work? No, for three reasons. The first one is that in a certain sense, Frankfurt is presupposing compatibilism or determinism by the very example. Note carefully that he thinks that there are things that he can observe about your mental states to determine whether you're going to do it or not. But that's a deterministic view, because on that view, it is your mental states that cause your subsequent mental states, which cause your body movements. But on the libertarian view, it is the agent's own free exercise of active power that causes his body to move. And there's nothing to observe because no conditions leading up to the moment of choice are sufficient to determine what you're going to do. Thus, the very idea that Frankfurt smuggles into the cases that you could observe and then know presuppose a compatibilist view and begs the question. The second thing, though, I think is even deeper, Tim, and that is that Frankfurt cases revealingly still have two-way ability.
Yeah.
And that two-way ability is not located in your body movements,
Mm-hmm.
because one way or the other, your arm's going to move and pull that trigger. The two-way ability is over what happens inside you, and it's the two-way ability between these. I exercise my active power and freely shoot the gentleman, or I refrain from exercising my active power, in which case the observer determines that my body moves.
Yeah.
So it doesn't rule out two-way ability.
Right.
It just relocates it from the body to my exercise of active power versus my refraining from exercising active power.
Free thinking.
It's a dismal failure when it comes to that two-way ability. And third, it really does focus on the wrong issue, as will come up later, perhaps. And the central idea behind a libertarian account of freedom is not two-way ability, though I do believe in that, but it's the concept of active power as opposed to a passive liability, and the first moving ability to exercise active power. By overlooking that, he thinks that his objections work, but Frankfurt focused on the wrong issue.
Yeah. So I'll just add that when we're discussing Frankfurt style cases, it's vital to note the agent in the scenario still seems to be a thinker and actor who is not causally determined if the agent freely chooses to think and act as the counterfactual intervening observer wants them to think and act. And so I contend that if the counterfactual intervener's hands are off, as it were, then the agent who could not actually pull it off and do otherwise is still free in the libertarian sense. So at least if there's reason to think that the agent is being causally determined by something or someone else, or no reason to think that. So the agent's libertarian freedom and then desert responsibility is only violated when the counterfactual observing intervener becomes an actual intervener. And Frankfurt cases still seem to presuppose and assume not merely what's called sourcehood libertarian freedom. JP, I think you call it the ability to be a first mover. But it seems to me that they also assume or are open to, as you noted, categorical alternative possibilities when it comes to thinkings and tryings, even though these cases show that the agent has no ability to actually pull the otherwise off in the physical world. So, for example, let's bring up another Frankfurt case, the voting thought experiment that many of our viewers are aware of. In this voting booth, the agent does seem to have libertarian freedom in the sense that the agent gets to decide and determine exactly how what must be the case is executed. And so does the agent vote on his own, not causally determined for the Republican, or does the counterfactual intervener causally determine the agent to cast the vote for the Republican candidate? You know, that choice is up to the agent and is not causally determined by the intervener. So ultimately, Frankfurt cases assume the agent has the opportunity and ability to think and try to do otherwise, and this is obvious given the existence of the counterfactual intervener. So these cases seem to be evidence of libertarian freedom, and they definitely don't rule it out. However, if the agent thinks or tries to do otherwise, then the counterfactual intervener will step in to ensure that the agent cannot actually pull it off and do otherwise. So would you add anything else to that, JP?
I think that is a spot on insight. And I would want to just draw attention to one thing you said that's really important. You used the word try. Mm-hmm. Now, that is in the active voice. I tried to call my wife. Mm-hmm. But there is no agency or active agency in a compatibilist framework. Yeah. So every time their view becomes plausible because they use active voice language. I don't think it's intentional, but that really masks what is really going on. And so if there's always what's called a reductive paraphrase available for active voice statements, used by compatibilists. For
Mhm.
example, if I say, I tried to call my wife, what really is going on is and attempting to call my wife was caused in me.
Yeah.
And by putting it passively, you really get clear on you did not try, you received a passive attempting triggering.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. So several folks have balked at our use of ED, or exhaustive divine determinism. And they complain that just the word determinism by itself already entails the exhaustive. So they say it's redundant to say exhaustive divine determinism, or as Bill Craig calls it, universal divine determinism. So JP, you and I say ed. Bill says UD, UDD. We both seem to mean the same thing. Interestingly, I don't see people complaining about Dr. Craig's use of universal divine determinism, but as soon as I add the word exhaustive to divine determinism, everyone loses their minds. So I find that a bit inconsistent. But anyway, why do you think it might be acceptable and helpful to be a little redundant while having these specific discussions?
Yeah, two thoughts on that, Tim. First of all, this claim is just false. If I could hold to determinism regarding the laws of physics and chemistry, but not determinism with regard to human action. So the very idea of determinism does not entail exhaustive determinism. That has to be added to get that, because you could hold to a limited determinism, as I myself might actually hold. But the second thing is, let's suppose that determinism does entail exhaustive divine determinism. Is that redundant? No, because sometimes a word is used not to qualify something different about its modifier, but to highlight or focus attention on something that is already there, but you want to make sure people pause and pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So the claim is either false or it's confusing a modifier as adding something new versus a modifier that's simply calling attention to something you want to emphasize.
Well said. Thank you for saying that and clarifying that for so many people who are following along on these topics. Well, in our paper, you and I distinguish between what we call weak libertarian freedom and strong libertarian freedom. And while you and I both agree that we do possess a strong libertarian freedom, a categorical ability to think and act otherwise on certain occasions in the real world, we suggest that all we need to do for our argument to pass is to merely show that we possess weak libertarian freedom, which is simply the ability to think such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine or necessitate one's thoughts and ensuing beliefs. To say it another way, all we have to do is show that at least on occasion, when we choose, think, or act, we are not causally determined by something or someone else when we choose, think, or act. Now, this may or not entail a categorical ability, but that's beyond the scope of our project and really irrelevant to our specific case. In fact, we showed that the free thinking argument can be defended without referencing the principle of alternative possibilities. So what would you say, JP, to those who demand that libertarian freedom necessarily entails alternative possibilities or the categorical ability to do otherwise?
Well, I say this charitably. I don't mean any offense at this, but they simply have not read the literature by libertarians themselves. If you have read that literature, you will recognize that the fundamental issue that libertarians focus on is active power. And that is the power to originate or be a source agent without anything determining me doing so. And a subsequent issue is the reality of alternative possibilities. there are a number of libertarians that just focus on active power, and that's sufficient to make the case against compatibilist determinism. So you don't need to focus on alternative possibilities or categorical ability.
Okay. Brady wants to know, what do you mean by robust naturalism, and what should a consistent naturalist affirm about reality?
Yes, a robust, there are two kinds of naturalism as a worldview. There is robust, some call it staunch naturalism, and then there's what is called faint-hearted naturalism. According to robust or staunch naturalism, the universe and everything within it is and only is physical. No non-physical entity of any kind exists within the universe, setting aside debates about abstract objects.
Yeah.
A faint-hearted naturalist is one who accepts the robust view, except adds that there are also unique emergent properties that are in no way present in or characterize their emergent bases, so that you could have property dualism with regard to consciousness. You could have some try to say that there's emergent intrinsic value when matter reaches the right level of complexity. So a robust naturalist is somebody who doesn't want to have anything to do with emergent properties.
Mm-hmm.
A faint-hearted one will help herself to emergent properties.
So does emergence solve any problems for the naturalist?
Well, I've got a broadside critique of emergentism that's going to be coming out down the road. But very quickly, emergence is not a solution to anything. It's a name for the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It just slaps a name on the problem. And the problem is, how could there be new kinds of properties that exist in the world? And emergence is a name for that problem. I think the solution is that there are new kinds of substances that come to be in the world, and they bring with them new properties. But secondly, if you admit to emergent properties, you have to realize that they are contingent brute facts. And by a brute fact, that means that advocates admit that they are in principle inexplicable. There can be no explanation for why they emerge, or else they wouldn't be emergent. One of the hallmarks of an emergent property is that even a God's eye knowledge of the subvenient base cannot allow you to tell one way or the other whether the emergent property will appear. So it's a nasty brute fact and a contingent one. The third problem is that you still have the problem of epiphenomenalism, because a naturalist is going to want to say that if there are emergent properties, they're still ontologically dependent on and grounded in the physical base. And if you accept the causal closure of the physical, that is, for any physical event, if you trace its causal ancestry that led up to it, you'll never have to leave the level of the physical. Then if there are emergent properties, they have no causal powers. They're epiphenomenal.
Right. Yeah. So even if consciousness was somehow able to emerge from physical properties, it still doesn't give you what we're arguing for in this paper, the libertarian freedom to think and be rational. It doesn't seem to me.
That's exactly right.
Cool.
Right.
All right. Well, let's keep going here. This is a rather long question or objection from my friend Colton, who is an ardent, exhaustive divine determinist and a compatibilist. And he's got some kind of somewhat of a following online. Now, since his objection is rather lengthy, I'll break this down into bite-sized portions here. So Colton says that Dirk Paraboom's epistemic openness condition and deliberative efficacy conditions if true, prove to be sufficient conditions for rational deliberation, even if determinism is true. One needn't possess metaphysical openness or categorical ability in order to rationally deliberate among options, each of which are compatible with one's cognitive faculties at time t. So that's the end of the first part. So JP, let's call this the Paraboom objection to the free thinking argument. And we've spilled a lot of ink, 3 or 4 pages worth, regarding Paraboom in our forthcoming paper. So without giving away all of the details here, since we still want people to read our paper, what are some general points that you'd like to make about this Paraboom objection, in which many determinists seem to have hanged all their hopes?
Well, first of all, it gives ersatz deliberation or pseudo deliberation, not the real item. In order to really deliberate, there has to be ontological alternatives that are possible, and I'll touch on deliberation shortly. If there's only one option ontologically that is really possible, then Paraboom's entire view, especially his openness condition, is where the so-called deliberator is doing so on the basis of believing a falsehood. Because the deliberator isn't saying, well, one of these is already determined, but I don't know which one it is, so I'm going to deliberate about what to do. The deliberator is saying, I've got several options that I could do, and I'm going to deliberate about which one. I mean, Van Inwagen has this little counterexample in Paraboom, and Paraboom looks at it, where this person is in a room and there are two doors and that are supposed ways out, but one is locked and there's only one way out. Now, in that case, if the person is aware of this, he can't deliberate about how he's going to get out, because he knows there's only one way. He can deliberate about which one he'll try,
right,
but that's a very different thing.
That's right.
So I think that this openness condition really requires the so-called deliberator to be operating on a false assumption about reality, and that's any view that should be rejected. And secondly, the Paraboom deliberator does not engage in real deliberation. Why do I say that? There are 4 features that are true of real deliberation, as anybody commonsensically knows who thinks about it, that aren't present in Paraboom's deliberator. For one, like I said, when a person's deciding what to do, that person understands that there are real alternative possibilities, and it's up to him to decide which one he's going to take. He doesn't think that one's closed, but I don't know what it is, so I can still deliberate even though there's no point in it. The second thing is that he talks about the efficacy of deliberation, but actually there is no efficacy of deliberation, because deliberation is, again, an active voice term.
Yeah.
And that is smuggled in to make Paraboom's account seem more intuitive. That's the intuition pump. Now, I'm not saying he did it on purpose.
Right.
But what's really going on is that there is a causal chain of events that began prior to the outside the agent and outside the person, and runs through him as a passive train of events. And whatever you want to mark off as the stage of, quote, deliberating, is just a series of passive events that began from a chain that was completely outside of his control. So he is having a process of passively receiving a series of thoughts that are not actually deliberations at all. They're just passive activities. Like Searle says, I'm not a determinist. So if you ask me, what do I want, coffee or not? I don't sit around and wait until I just see what I'm going to do. I often choose what I'm going to do. The third thing is that real deliberation has intrinsic immanent teleology. We deliberate for the sake of reaching the best or most rational or true conclusion.
Right.
So a deliberation is done teleologically, but efficient causal chains do not have immanent teleology.
Yeah.
So the causal chains, for example, that run from outside through a machine, the machine moves in such a way that the designer can act as if they're moving for the sake of a certain end for which he designed the machine, so they can be taken as teleological, but they really aren't. They're just efficient causes. And so the deliberator is not engaging in effective deliberation because he's not actively doing it for the sake of an immanent teleological end. And then finally, the agent is not actively deliberating because the agent isn't involved at all. You have to understand compatibilism is consistent with there not being an agent.
Yeah.
In fact, an awful lot of naturalist compatibilists don't believe in a self or an agent of any kind. And even if you believe in a soul, the soul is not involved in compatibilist processes. What produces the action of the body movement, let's say, or the concluding thought is not the agent.
Right.
The series of mental states that led up in efficient causal chains to the passive obtaining of that quote unquote conclusion. And so it is just wrong to talk about agents.
Right.
Agents, even if there are such, have nothing whatsoever to do with compatibilist chains and quote unquote conclusions.
Yeah. In my book, I referenced that I referenced a human on that view as nothing more than a bag of beliefs, none of which are up to the bag.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I've been aware of Paraboom's work for a while, and several individuals, when first exposed to the free thinking argument, really made a big ruckus about Paraboom's work. So back then, I carefully looked it over, and I immediately noticed that Paraboom seems to be discussing something completely different than what the free thinking argument is really focused upon. So at that time, I didn't even think Paraboom's case was in need of interaction, but I'm kind of new to this game. So to my surprise, many determinists seem to think otherwise, that we needed to interact with Paraboom. So as I told you, when we decided to work on this paper together, we had to take down the so-called Paraboom Objection. And on this topic, JP, I got to tell you, you really shared some keen insights. Our paper offers, I think, at least 4 reasons to judge the Paraboom Objection as a failure. Now, like I said, I don't want to give too much of our paper away in this video, so I'll simply note that Colton's claim here misses the mark of our argument's intent. Our argument is not primarily focused on the issue of metaphysical openness and categorical abilities. That may or may not follow from what we argue, but rather the free thinking argument is laser focused on the foundational problem of being completely deterministically mind controlled by something or someone else, nature or nature's God, especially something non-rational or someone who is untrustworthy. So let me describe Dirk Paraboom's position to those who are new to the conversation. Paraboom is what's called a free will skeptic. And this view says that the idea of free will, both compatibilist and libertarian accounts, are likely false. And more importantly, that giving up the belief in free will is not devastating to notions of agency and morality. So, according to Paraboom and Company, one can rationally deny libertarian freedom and free will in general and continue to live a normal and meaningful life. And so, to that, I have a couple of things to say. First, if living a normal and meaningful life means that you believe that non-rational or untrustworthy causes determine all of your thoughts and beliefs all the time, then sure, if that's normal and meaningful, then have at it. But I don't think most people are going to buy that. Moreover, for the sake of argument, suppose that we grant that giving up libertarian freedom is not devastating to our notions of morality, which I think is absurd, but I'll grant it for the moment. But JP, you and I argue quite effectively, if I don't say so myself, that if one affirms exhaustive determinism, then it does devastate our notion of rationality, at least the kind of rationality worth wanting. Now, by deliberation, the way I understand Paraboom's understanding is that deliberation is an active mental process whose goal, or telos, is to figure out from among a number of alternative options what would be the best for one to do, and I would add, more importantly, what would be the best for one to believe. And I don't think that gets the proper attention, but you and I are bringing attention to it. But moreover, the process of deliberation, according to Paraboom, can, but doesn't have to include the weighing and evaluating of reasons. And to that I say, not so fast. If, for example, God causally determines all things, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, then all of one's mental processes are passive as opposed to active, as you noted earlier, by definition. And we discussed this in our paper. And sure, if all of one's mental processes are determined by God, then the human passive cog, as it were, might be determined to experience the subjective sensation of actively thinking things through and the sensation of attempting to figure things out. But objectively and ontologically speaking, this is only a subjective illusion imposed upon a passive cog. And moreover, if Ed is true, then God determines exactly how a passive cog weighs, evaluates, judges, and ultimately reasons. The entirety of one's mental life is caused and determined by something or someone else if determinism entails the exhaustive. So with that said, what do you think, JP?
Well, I think that's just true. And one of the things that those who adopt exhaustive divine determinism fail to appreciate is the transitivity of efficient causal chains. Now, a relation is transitive, like larger than. Mm-hmm. If A stands in that relation to B and B stands in that relation to C, then A stands in that relation to C. So if A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. Yeah. Efficient causal chains are the causal relation is transitive. So that means that if A causes B and B causes C, then A causes C through B. But then you have to ask, well, what caused A? And something else caused A through something else. And if you don't stop transitive regresses, the medievals called them per se regresses, you will get no causality because you have to start with a first mover that doesn't have to borrow causal power before it can lend it on. Every member in the chain is a borrowing lender. And if you don't stop with an owner that doesn't borrow, the whole thing can't get off the ground. And that first source, that first mover, is the responsible agent for the entire causal chain, including false beliefs and immoral actions. So they have to grapple more with the transitivity problem.
Amen to that. Well, and I'd just like to make another point to this whole thing by asking a question. If a deity of deception determines Dirk Paraboom to affirm a false belief, then how can Dirk Paraboom rationally deliberate and infer a better or true belief in that same circumstance? Now, that's an impossible task. And so what I want people to see here is that this kind of a process of deliberation that you and I are concerned with, JP, and that we discuss in our paper, seems to be far different than what my friend Colton has in mind. And these different concepts ought not be conflated. So the same word is being used to describe two
Yes.
completely different things.
Yes.
And so we talk past each other. So indeed, the kind of deliberating ability that Colton has in mind does not seem to be worth wanting. I mean, that's sure not what I want. The kind of deliberation, the power that allows humans to infer true beliefs over false ones and ultimately be epistemically responsible, is a kind of deliberation worth wanting. But that kind of deliberating power requires libertarian freedom, and it is not compatible with determinism. So bottom line, according to the model Colton assumes, God, and I would say a deity of deception, deterministically prevents Paraboom from attaining truth during the so-called process of deliberation, which the deity of deception is also completely determining. So God deterministically prevents Paraboom from attaining truth by causally determining him to believe a falsehood. And anyway, that just doesn't seem to be the kind of ability to deliberate worth wanting. Would you add anything else to that, JP?
No, I completely agree with you. In fact, as I said earlier, and as you pointed out, it's not real deliberation.
Yeah.
One of the things that philosophers or theologians sometimes do is, in arguing against a position, they'll co-opt the same term, but they will redefine it. And the naive observer thinks that they're debating about the same thing. But what's really going on is there's been a shift in meaning, and it is not what the original person was claiming was necessary for something.
Right.
And that's why I say this is ersatz or pseudo deliberation, because of a number of things it misses. And we mention a lot of those that we can't do here in our paper. But that's why I agree that you're right.
I get so frustrated when people change the definition of terms and without telling anybody. And even philosophers do this. In fact, I wrote an article on my website recently talking about how the word compatibilism has even changed meaning. I mean, it used to mean that free will is somehow compatible with determinism, but now a lot of philosophers, against the advice of people like Peter Van Inwagen, are saying, no, it's moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And everybody winds up talking past each other. The waters get muddy, and I try to clear up the waters, and then people get mad. It's just frustrating. And it's all, I also do ministry with Mormons on a regular basis, and we use the same words, but we mean completely different things by them. So it's always important, as our friend Greg Kokel says, to always ask, what do you mean by that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great question.
All right. Well, Colton adds, I have yet to see convincing counters to Paraboom's theory other than mere intuition. So this raises an interesting question about intuition, JP. Can we put any stock in our intuition if a non-rational or untrustworthy cause determines our intuitions?
Well, no. Our intuitions would not be genuine insights into reality, but they would be up to the whims of the deterministic agent who brought them about. They would have nothing to do with their intentional object. They would have to do with whatever the chain that led up to them.
Yeah, exactly. And we discuss intuition in our paper.
Yes.
And I think it's vital to point out that appealing to intuition only makes sense if the cause and creator of human intuition is reliable, especially when we're discussing metaphysical and theological beliefs. And so we got into this a bit in our last video. I want to point people to that discussion. We talked about reliable calculators. But if human intuition is intelligently designed by a deity of deception who causally determines all Christians to affirm false beliefs and intuit beliefs that do not match metaphysical and theological reality, then we have no reason to put any stock in our intuition when it comes to these matters. However, on our shared Molinist view, God is a perfectly good and maximally great being who desires all humans to gain knowledge of truth, 1 Timothy 2:4, and we can attain metaphysical and theological truths via these faculties that God has given us if we choose to be careful. And if that view is true, then we have reason to put stock in our intuition. But if the deity of deception determines our thoughts, beliefs, and intuitions, then we cannot be more careful and think correctly. We can't try to think better. So in fact, it's impossible to be more careful and to take faulty thinking captive to obey Christ, as Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 10:5, if a deity of deception causally determines a Christian to affirm false theological thoughts and beliefs. And if determinism is true, it doesn't make any sense to discuss trying to be more careful in one's process of thinking things through. I'll throw it back at you. Anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you're right. And I'll just focus on the whole issue of trying again.
Mm-hmm.
Trying is an endeavoring.
Yeah.
It's trying to bring it about that. It is an exercising of power. There are no tryings in a deterministic, exhaustively deterministic world. And that's why Calvinist interpretations of certain texts imply who can resist his will, and you have to be regenerated before you can believe. And it's not really you believing anyway. It's a God producing a belief in you. So I don't even think there could be endeavorings or trying. And if you knew determinism was true, what's the point of trying? Because whether you're going to try or not is determined, and that would lead to passivity, not active trying.
That's right. That's right. And and you mentioned being regenerated to be caused to have true beliefs, but the fact of it, I mean, the mere fact that there's so many 4 views books out there implies that Christians, regenerated Christians, get so many theological beliefs wrong. And so on this Ed view, God is causing and determining all of these mature Christian theologians to affirm false beliefs. And that's quite problematic, I think. Now, Colton continues. I told you Colton wrote a long and thoughtful question for us to answer. I do appreciate that. And Colton says, if deliberation compatibilism is true, then yes, you can be blamed for thinking and believing X while being determined by something or someone else to think and believe X, because that is what compatibilism means. And then he says, one should be blamed for thinking and believing X because X is false. And if deliberation compatibilism is true, it does not matter if one believes that they were determined to believe that X is true, even though X is false. Why, he asks? Because deliberation compatibilism is true. And then Colton follows that by saying, your question then to me is just so trivial. So how would you respond to Colton's claims there, JP?
Well, that's why views like this lead to skepticism, and they are actually close cousins of postmodern relativism. I mean, if you go back all the way back to Cornelius Van Til, who said that there are no neutral facts and all facts are worldview dependent, and Christians and unbelievers live in different worlds. Well, then there is in principle nothing that you can appeal to that would be shared by competing paradigms, and the meanings of your terms, your standards of rationality are just going to be incommensurable there, and so you end up with just shouting or just saying your view. You can't, in principle, argue for them because there's nothing in common on the basis of which you could argue. But I've got to say something about this claim that you should be blamed for thinking something, believing something X because X is false. Nobody believes that. That's so bad. Now think about scientists who for centuries did their work and tried hard and ended up with a very reasonable belief that the Bohr electron existed. Now, unknown to them, a century later or so, we would discover that there aren't Bohr electrons, that there are quantum electrons, but that evidence was not in principle available to them. Do I heap epistemic blame on them because they had a false belief? No. Now, take a jury trial that ends up with what everybody would agree was the most reasonable judgment. He is guilty. Unknown to them and actually unavailable to them was evidence that would be discovered 10 years after the trial that showed that, in fact, he wasn't guilty, but he was innocent, but no one had access to that kind of information. Nobody blames that jury for being epistemically irresponsible in drawing the guilty verdict.
Right.
So it isn't truth. It's choosing to be epistemically responsible and trying to take into account as best you can all the factors and weigh them freely and wisely as best you can.
Yeah.
Little children, I'll close with this, that are 3-4 years old, that are raised in a Muslim community by mom and dad, end up believing that Allah is God, but they can't reason, or they just believe it because their parents and their community told them that. Now, I do not blame those little children for having a false belief. That they have a false belief might be consequential in some other ways. That's a different question.
Yeah.
But I don't blame them epistemically for that, or even aleithically, because that little child had a false belief and did the best the little child could do at 4 years old. So it is knowledge of truth, which requires rational deliberation, that is the appropriate object of epistemic praise or blame. It isn't truth per se, but because there are times when we don't have access to what we need, but we do the best with what we can.
That's right. Doing the best with what we can or with what we have. Again, that just implies libertarian freedom. It assumes it, these tryings. So great point. And I just want to underscore the fact that Colton's view seems to reduce to absurdity. I mean, ultimately, his view espouses that a person should be blamed for thinking, intuiting, believing, and behaving in the exact manner as God causally determined the person to think, intuit, believe, and behave. And I bet most would find this view as absurd as I do. And absurdity is a great reason to reject a view. So let's expand upon this absurdity by focusing on Colton's next point. He's not finished. He adds and says, I can say as a compatibilist that we can have rational responsibility while still saying I am, and he's talking about his deliberations are determined by God, and yet I am still a rational deliberative agent. Okay, so according to Colton's view of Ed, he is determined to hold false beliefs by a non-trustworthy cause, even if as I'm calling God here, the deity of deception, even if he has morally sufficient reasons to be a deity of deception, he's still a deity of deception. And this, I think, results in absurdity. And here's why. It's clear and intuitive that Colton is not responsible for what other things cause. And I think this is far clearer than, the metaphysical maxim those who advance the Kalam cosmological argument affirm. Out of nothing, nothing comes. That's intuitive, and that's strong intuition right there, and most people grasp that much. But speaking of the Kalam, Colton is not responsible for the existence of the universe. So he should neither be praised or blamed for something that God caused and determined. Colton should not be held responsible for the existence of demons. That was up to and caused by God. Colton should not be held responsible for the decay of uranium, causing lead to come into existence. That's not up to Colton either. And Colton should not be held responsible for his own birth. This is because things other than Colton caused and determined all of these things. Now, similarly, Colton is not responsible for a deity of deception causally determining all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, and at least that's what follows on Colton's view. Thus, Colton, on his view, should not be held responsible for God determining Colton to affirm false theological beliefs. So according to Colton's own view, Colton is a passive cog at the mercy of the whims of a deity of deception, and passive cogs do not seem to be the kinds of things that we should praise or blame. Passive cogs are not responsible in a desert sense for what another agent, and God in this scenario, causally determines. And I think to suggest otherwise is utterly absurd. So it seems that Colton's own view, although he is a really smart young man, but it seems that his view reduces to absurdity, and that's a great reason to reject his view. So I've talked too much. What do you think, JP?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, what bothers me is that your point is obvious when we're talking about everyday life, the illustrations you gave. When we're talking about ordinary life, if we know for a fact that somebody was a body moved because something caused it, and they didn't, well, we don't hold them responsible for that. But when it comes to theology now, all of a sudden, we do special pleading. And I think that is not only a poor methodology and it leads to false beliefs in this case, but it's extremely harmful because it ends up giving people an agenda-driven view that whose advocates are so inflexible that they won't acknowledge the strength of their opposition's case. And I think that he just changes horses when he gets to the theological realm. He doesn't act the way he does the rest of his life, nor does he believe. I really think. I don't think he really believes in compatibilism about day to day. I think his spontaneous reactions reveal his beliefs, and those are libertarian.
All right. Well, Colton makes one more point. This will be the last thing we look at from Colton here. And he says, I've given you a detailed comment to address. Paraboom's epistemic openness and deliberative efficacy conditions. Or why isn't S, epistemic openness, and DE, deliberative efficacy, compatible with rational responsibility? Take it away, JP.
Well, I've already addressed that, just in the sense that epistemic openness is the view that, so far as I know, and consistent with all the things that I have settled on, option A is open, option B, and A1, A2, and so on. But in fact, that's not true. So packed into epistemic openness is a false belief. And the efficacy of deliberation is not real deliberation, as I pointed out. It's pseudo deliberation because it misses a number of things that characterize genuine deliberation, as is known by everybody without an axe to grind in this thing.
Right.
And so I don't want to go over that again, but I do think that his view, Paraboom's view, then entails that the person has two false beliefs in order for him to satisfy S and DE. There's also the false belief that if you believe in determinism, that is logically inconsistent with the ontological openness and actual efficacy of deliberation, and you avoid a contradiction only by holding the two other false beliefs, so that these aren't understood ontologically, they're only understood epistemically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we do have 4 reasons to think that the Paraboom objection to the free thinking argument is that it fails at the end of the day. That'll be in our paper, so stay tuned for that. And I just want to thank Colton for his informed and thoughtful and long objection. Thank you for sending it our way. Colton, I want you to know I sincerely appreciate you, brother. And your informed pushback really has helped to solidify this argument. So thank you. So let's shift gears. We'll start to wrap things up. Tyler Vela, another friend of mine and hardcore Calvinist and exhaustive divine determinist. He says, Tim, after watching our first video, he says, Tim, could you provide or ask Moreland to give you these studies that he referenced that demonstrate that libertarian freedom is a properly basic belief, let alone the folk view. So refresh my memory, JP, but not only did you make a passing comment in our last video regarding these studies, but you actually argue that libertarian freedom is a properly basic belief, right? I mean, you actually point out the difference in our experience between passive thoughts and active thoughts. What do you have to say?
Right. There was an article in a multi-edited book that was published by 2 guys at Purdue, and I can picture this guy. He's a little short guy. He's got a beard. His brother taught Old Testament at Dallas Seminary, and for the life of me, I mean, I read this a while back. I'm embarrassed to say I can't get his name back, but if you were to look at the names of their faculty and some of the Old Testament profs at Dallas, and then you could maybe look up his publications.
Okay.
They cite evidence that when they present libertarianism and compatibilism in their initial form to classes, that 90% who don't know anything about it are saying, well, that's not freedom.
Right.
This is what we mean by it. And then there was a study, I think, done by the APA, but again, I am embarrassed to say that I don't have off the top of my head those studies. But I think it might be easy to find some if you Googled it.
Yeah.
Studies that show that the common sense view is libertarian freedom, or that libertarian freedom is a part of folk psychology or folk ontology, something like that.
Yeah.
I want to apologize to Tim.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah. What was his name again?
This is Tyler who's asking that question.
Tyler, forgive me. I don't have that off the top of my aging head.
Well, you can't be aware of everything you know all at once. So. Well, I would just add anecdotally that I currently have a 100% track record when I give these unofficial surveys, at least to those who don't have an axe to grind, like you said. I've never, I talk about this stuff in churches all around the country. I've never had anyone who is not previously committed to determinism for some reason say that they believe all of their thoughts and beliefs are causally determined by something or someone else. And if I ever suggest that to anybody, they look at me like I'm crazy. In fact, I see this change the minds of many people who do seem to want to say that we don't have the libertarian freedom to act or to think. And I see this on a regular basis. In fact, just last week I was in Arizona. I was there doing some ministry with some of our mutual friends, Brett Kunkel and Eric Hernandez with Maven. And somebody there told me that they were a Calvinist and a determinist. And so then I asked them the following. I said, does God determine you to sin, or does God provide a way of escape so that you don't have to sin when you do sin? 1 Corinthians 10:13. And they'll typically quickly affirm that God provides the way of escape so that they do not have to sin in that exact circumstance. And thus, if they choose to sin, it was not causally determined by God. And so, with this in mind, the vast majority of folks assume they possess the libertarian freedom to think, and I contend that this is the folk view. So, what would you say to that, JP?
Well, I think that's been my experience too. It is anecdotal, but anecdotal sometimes means testimony, and testimony is a source of evidence.
Yeah. All right. So I've seen some people complain that you and I have merely assumed incompatibilism. This is after watching the last video, as opposed to arguing against compatibilism. Is that true?
Well, no. I've already given reasons in our paper,
Right.
and I believe I've mentioned them here, that my primary way of knowing that I have libertarian freedom is that I'm aware of the phenomenological difference between an active thought and a passive thought.
Yeah.
They have a different phenomenological texture or feel.
There you go. Yeah.
When I choose to think about something, that has a feel that I am now responsible for thinking about this, as opposed to hearing a lecture where I'm literally a passive recipient. Those have different textures to them. And so it becomes as evident as my awareness that a coffee cup is not the same thing as a lamp, that the same kind of direct awareness allows me to discern differences between or among things, and it applies to this case. So that's not an assumption.
Right. Yeah. You and I have argued that epistemic responsibility is not compatible with determinism in our paper. And so, I just want to make it clear to everybody out there, JP and I are definitely incompatibilists for good reason, right? We argue is for good reason in this extremely vital sense. Would you add anything to that?
No, I think it's been good for today. And
I agree.
Thanks for inviting me on, and it's been a great time.
Yeah, well, I just want to tell everybody out there that JP and I are looking forward to potential objections that are sure to come up after our paper is published. And we're looking forward to that, and we're ready and willing to continue defending and discussing the free thinking argument, even right here on this YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe, ring that bell so that you don't miss a thing. And also, please let us know what you thought of this conversation in the comments below, and share this video with anyone who is even slightly interested in issues related to free will and theology. So in closing, once again, I want to thank everyone on Facebook and Twitter who sent me these questions to address in the video. We couldn't get to all of them. I apologize. But of course, I've got to thank you once again, Dr. Moreland, for partnering with me to advance this important argument that reaches multiple conclusions about reality, including the existence of God and things like God. And our paper should be published in 2023, but I talked to somebody today and it looks like it might be published in late 2022. So I'm hoping for that. Anyway, I know it's a long wait, but unlike YouTube videos and blogs, that's the con of academic publishing. Well, in closing, JP, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Just thank you for inviting me. It's been a privilege, and it's been fun working with you.
The pleasure has been all mine. And so JP and I will be back in the future. So in the meantime, stay tuned, stay reasonable. And as the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 5:13, you are called to live in freedom. See you later.